It is my honor and pleasure this evening to introduce to everyone Professor Andrew P. Jackson, Sekou Molefi Baako. He is the Executive Director Emeritus of the Langston Hughes Community Library and Cultural Center in Corona, which is a branch of the Queens Public Library. He's also a professor of library science at Queens College and a professor of Africana Studies at York College. He is an appointed member of the Queens Public Library's Board of Trustees, and he is a founding member of Borough President's Queens General Assembly, and we're very fortunate to have him with us this evening. He's going to do a presentation tonight that will compare the meaning of July 4th, 1776 to June 19th, 1865. These are both dates of celebrations of freedom, or are they? So Professor Jackson, welcome and thank you.
Thank you, and thank you. Welcome everybody this evening from near and far, and thank you for this opportunity to share my thoughts and history about our American history, also known as Black American history. I'd like to begin my presentation with a quote from Dr. John Henrik Clarke, and then a second quote from Dr. Carter G. Woodson. Dr. Clarke once said, "History is a clock that tells a people their historical time of day. It is a compass that people use to locate themselves on the map of human geography. A people's history tells a people where they have been and what they have been, where they are and what they are. More importantly, a proper understanding of history tells a people where they still must be and where they still must go." Dr. Woodson's words from his book, The Miseducation of the Negro: "If a race has no history, if it has no worthwhile traditions, it becomes a negligible factor in the thought of the world, stands in danger of being exterminated." When we look at the Emancipation Proclamation, we have to go back to the man who created that document, President Abraham Lincoln. From Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln and the Dawn of Liberty, the author says, and I quote, "President Lincoln, like most whites of his day, didn't think Blacks or any people of color rated full equality, but he did believe that all people had a right to the fruits of their own labor. He truly loathed slavery. He saw it as a plain wrong and a blot on the nation, as an anathema of its ideals. Problem was, as lawyer Lincoln interpreted the Constitution, the US government could not regulate an institution within a state, be that institution marriage or be that institution slavery," unquote. In 1862, Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune, published an editorial addressed to the President Lincoln, pressuring him on his stance on slavery and urging abolition. Lincoln's response to Greeley was, and I quote, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and it is not either to save or destroy slavery. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps save the Union." His intention on all accounts was to save the Union and not specifically address the issue of slavery if he could get away with it. So we look at this date that we just finished commemorating a few weeks ago, June 19th, 1865, called Juneteenth, also known as Freedom Day, Emancipation Day, Jubilee Day, and Liberation Day. It is the oldest known celebration honoring the end of slavery in the United States. And I'll say the legal ending of slavery in the United States. That's another lecture. May 20th, 1865 is celebrated as Freedom Day in Florida, the day their enslaved were informed that they were free. And I just learned today, August 8th is celebrated as Emancipation Day in Tennessee, the day that future President Andrew Johnson at that time freed his slaves in East Tennessee. Originally celebrated in Texas on June 19th, 1866, to mark the first anniversary of the day that African Americans there first learned of their Emancipation Proclamation, more than 2 years after initially issued by President Abraham Lincoln. The Civil War ended in April 1865. So let's look at Texas, a closer look at Texas. And I looked at a work that I found called The Alamo, the first and last Confederate monument by George Gonzalez Ezera, the Alice Drysdale Sheffield Professor of History at the University of Texas in Austin. He said, according to myth, the Alamo honors the resilience and courage of Anglos and Tejanos pitted against American centralism, brutality, and corruption. In fact, the Alamo is about emancipation and slavery. Slavery separated the Republic of Mexico from the United States. American freedom led to one of the largest hemispheric spikes of Black captivity as British industrial demand for cotton led to an upsurge of racialized plantation slavery in the United States South. In Mexico, on the other hand, the wars of independence between 1808 and 1824 led to the almost complete eradication of slavery. And quote, it says, it was countless years of months after thousands of enslaved Black people had fled to Mexico to try to create freedom for themselves. Some scholars estimate that as many as 10,000 enslaved people used this southern route of the Underground Railroad to escape American exceptionalism. After all, Mexico had outlawed slavery in 1829, a fact that angered the white slave-owning settlers who had moved into that northern province of Texas. And this is from a presentation that was given by Dr. George White, the professor of history and interim dean of the School of Arts and Sciences at York College. Texas was a region long used to indigenous slavery. For a full decade between 1825 and 1835, leading Afro-Mexican generals and politicians in Mexico City witnessed with growing concern the expansion of racialized plantation slavery in Texas. According to John James III in his book, Black Perspectives article, The Problem of Whitewashing Juneteenth, the Lone Star State's relationship to Blacks is a unique one guided by a constitution that was repeatedly altered to ensure white privilege. The historical record shows that the Texas Constitution 1836 was an Excalibur wielded by white power brokers against the free and enslaved Blacks. The sword was sharpest when carving a place of subservience for enslaved Blacks or banishing free Blacks from the Republic. The actions of white elites were motivated by the increasing numbers of enslaved Blacks being brought into Texas by slave owners. The numbers were astounding. In 1845, there were 30,000 slaves. In 1850, increased to 58,161. As we get closer to the beginning of the Civil War, 1860, 182,566 enslaved Africans were in Texas. In 1835, Mexico passed a centralizing constitution abolishing slavery and sent an army led by Santa Anna to dismantle the Texas Cotton Kingdom. And this is a very different interpretation of the story of the Alamo than what we've been led to believe. Anglo settlers fled to Louisiana, including the retreating armies of Sam Houston. Santa Anna split his cavalry to cut off Houston at the Sabine River. In a serendipitous last-moment decision, Houston turned around to confront the weakened Santa Anna army, and Houston won. The Lone Star Republic of Texas was born. Many enslavers from outside the Lone Star State had moved there as they viewed it as a safe haven for slavery. Until 1845, Texas was a pariah state, shunned by the British, the French, and the United States of America. The public infrastructure to secure plantation slavery was financed after 1845 with federal dollars. The only thing Texas did well as an independent republic was to draft the Constitution in 1841. It made illegal for any manumitted Black or free Black to remain physically in the state, let alone aspire to citizenship. In 1836, John Quincy Adams described the Texas Revolt as the first war between slavery and emancipation. The Alamo memorializes the first battle of the American Civil War, fully 25 years before the battle at Fort Sumter. It is the first Confederate monument of slavery. Jones adds, despite pervasive misconceptions, Black Galvestonians learned of the Emancipation Proclamation the year that it debuted. This information created a reasonable expectation among enslaved Blacks that Jubilee was imminent. However, they soon learned that their bonded status would remain because Union troops were not occupying Texas. The absence of Union troops from the Republic extended the enslavement of 250,000 Blacks for 30 months after Lincoln's announcement. The dogged strength of Texas slavery heightened the importance of Union General Gordon Granger's arrival and his taking control of the Department of Texas on June 10th, 1865. Granger would repeat this message at the local courthouse, the customs house, and at the Negro Church on Broadway. The city of Galveston was one of many stops that Granger would make during his next 6 weeks. Not until summer's end had the emancipation message spread throughout the entire Republic of Texas. When we look at the white power brokers' resistance to emancipation, we see in Jones's article, he says, in quote, "The historical record proves that white power brokers' resistance to emancipation began decades before Jubilee. It should not surprise no one when plantation owners usurped General Order No. 3 by General Granger by forcing emancipated Blacks to work through the harvest season. From the plantation owner's perspective, even in freedom, Blacks would have no say in how their lives unfolded," unquote. He says it's indicative of whites' determination to remain political and economic control of the Lone Star State. Was an editorial that appeared 48 hours after General Granger's announcement in Galveston. So even after the announcement that they were free, the white power structure was already fighting back on it. He says this attempt to overthrow an institution that has become a part of our social system in which our entire population has believed essential to the welfare of both races, and all we can do in our present entire dependence on the clemency of our conquerors is to repeat to them what we have been urging for so many years, that the attempt to set the Negro free from all restraint and making him politically the equal of the white man will be the most disastrous to the whole country and absolutely ruinous to the South. This is the response in that article in the newspaper. White Texans responded to General Granger's message by buttressing their privileged status with increasing amounts of physical violence and unprecedented discriminatory legal codes called Black codes, aimed at, quote, ensuring the uninterrupted impoverishment of Black laborers, and B, ensuring the continuation of white supremacy. So when you look at the Reconstruction era between 1865 and 1876, you're looking at a decade following the Civil War with the intent of binding the wounds of war to restore the unity to the nation. It was one of the most turbulent and controversial chapters in American history. And you realize that this Juneteenth presentation that was made by General Granger is happening during the period of Reconstruction after the Civil War. Southerners attempted to reduce the status of free Blacks to nominal slavery. Yet it was an unprecedented moment in interracial democracy when the first 7 colored senators and congressional representatives were elected in the 41st and 42nd Congress of the United States. And this was key to the beginning of what Reconstruction could have been, or the promise of what Reconstruction could have been, with the aftermath of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, by having that integrated Senate and Congress. In fact, there are more people in that Senate and Congress at that time than we have Blacks in Senate and Congress even today. President Lincoln issued an executive order known as the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, which is meant to give freedom to the enslaved in 11 Southern Confederate states in rebellion with the Union: South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, Texas, Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Arkansas. This proclamation did not apply to northern states that had also held slaves, or to those southern border states, those 5 southern slave states that did not secede from the Union but remained loyal to President Lincoln and to the Union. And they were Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and West Virginia. The proclamation read in part, quote, "All persons held as slaves held within any state or designated part of the state, the people whereof shall be in rebellion against the United States, shall be thenceforward, and forever free. General Gordon Granger and his federal troops of approximately 2,000 Black soldiers traveled to the Southwest to assess the aftermath of the Civil War. When General Granger arrived in Galveston, he learned that African Americans were still working as slaves on plantations. General Granger announced in General Order Number 3 that, and I quote, "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free." Goes on to say, this involved an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection hereto existing between them becomes between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. So this is the first time you see in an executive order coming as an aftermath from an executive order from the President of the United States. This involved an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves. That is something that requires even more research and more discussion at another time. In some cases, enslavers withheld the information until after the harvest season, as we'd heard. While the order was critical to expanding freedom to enslaved people, the racist language used in the last sentences foreshadowed that the fight for equal rights would continue. Juneteenth has been formally celebrated primarily by people in African-American communities in Texas since 1866, and later celebrated in other states. In 2022, President Joseph Biden officially designated June 19th, Juneteenth National Independence Day, spurred on by the advocates in the and the members of the Congressional Black Caucus on June 15th, 2021. The Senate unanimously passed the Juneteenth National Independence Day Act, and it subsequently passed through the House of Representatives, establishing June 19th as a federal holiday. Governor Andrew Cuomo signed legislation in October 2020, officially marking Juneteenth, also known as Freedom Day, as a state public holiday, several months after he had issued an executive order recognizing Juneteenth as a holiday for state employees. When signing this legislation, Cuomo noted that the holiday is intended to celebrate the achievements of Black community and provide an opportunity for self-reflection on the systematic injustices that face our society. When you look at American Independence Day, July 4th, 1776, and Juneteenth, 1865, Freedom Day, you see two different discussions of freedom and two different concepts of freedom and who it applies to. July 4th is the annual celebration of America's independence from British rule and the establishment of our independent democracy called the United States of America. In the document called the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Constitution says, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Constitutional amendments that relate specifically to African Americans at that time in 1766. Article 1, Section 2, the 3/5 clause, how enslaved Africans should be counted for allocating taxes and seats in Congress and electoral votes as 3/5 of a human being, adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, 3/5 of all other persons. They never referred to them as slaves or slavery. They use the term other persons or strangers or outsiders. The term slavery and slaves are not mentioned in the Constitution. Article 1, Section 9 legalizes the institution of slavery, a compromise that allowed the lower southern states to legally continue the Atlantic slave trade for at least 20 years through 1808. The illegal slave trade, called the domestic slave trade, would continue from 1808 until the end of the Civil War. Because I remember one of my things my students kept saying, well, if the Constitution says slavery ends in 1808, then why did we have the Emancipation Proclamation and why did we have the Civil War, et cetera, because legally it ended in 1808. But now another phase of slavery, I call the second chapter of slavery, begins with what's called the domestic slave trade from 1808 to 1865. The third article, Article 4, Section 2, called the Fugitive Slave Clause. No person held in service or labor in one state shall be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered upon claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. This allows for the legal return of runaway private property or fugitive slaves, runaway slaves. The Constitution provides freedoms for all whites, elevated above blacks, free or slave. Africans are seen as outsiders and strangers, thus treated differently and with no rights or legal privileges. Africans are seen only as tools to amass profits. And then you have to look back a little bit before that in 1857 with the Dred Scott, Missouri Supreme Court compromise, decision, not compromise, decision. The case of a Missouri slave and his wife whose master moved from a slave state to a free state. Scott petitioned the court for his freedom. The legal ruling by Chief Justice Roger B. Taney of the Supreme Court said that Scott is illegal to petition the court because he is not a citizen. Even in a free state, Scott is still considered a slave. That blacks free or slave could never be citizens of the United States according to the intent of the founding fathers and the Constitution. The federal government had no authority to ban slavery in the federal territories. And this is what was referred to early in the discussion between Lincoln and Greeley. And then the statement that shocked me when I first realized it and read it over and over to my students. In quotes by Chief Justice Roger B. Taney in the Dred Scott, Missouri Supreme Court decision in 1857. And I repeat this in quotes. Blacks, whether free or slave, have no rights that the white man is bound to respect. And I repeat that again. In quotes by Chief Justice Roger B. Taney in 1857 Supreme Court decision, blacks, whether free or slave, have no rights that white man is bound to respect, unquote. So if you look at the freedoms gained by African Americans through Reconstruction amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, they are this. The 13th Amendment in 1865 ends legal slavery in the United States. The 14th Amendment in 1867 provides citizenship rights, except for those sentenced for a crime and provides due process of law. Now, when I talk about that second continuation of slavery, or the third chapter in slavery, after the domestic slave trade ends in 1865 with the end of the Civil War, you have a whole era. That's the third chapter of slavery. That is those who have been alleged to have committed a crime and a sentence. For example, a person who is now free at the end of the Civil War and is free, is walking along the railroad tracks looking for a job, or walking along the railroad tracks looking for family members. Black codes that limit the freedoms of Black people at that time. One simple code was you had to show a visible means of support. In essence, you had to have a job. I just got out of slavery. I'm looking for work. I'm looking for my family. Now you have committed a crime because you are unemployed. Now you are put in jail, and there's a whole new series of slavery that people put in jail for not working, and now they have to pay a fine, and they're put in jail for an undetermined period of time. Many of those people went into slavery, that form of slavery, and were never released. And there's several books that have been written about that. One of them is called The New Slavery by Michelle Alexander. The 15th Amendment of the Constitution in 1870 gives voting rights for Black men equal to white men. Women had no legal, were not able to legally vote at this time in America. So when and if you celebrate July 4th, you are celebrating it as an American citizen. Our ancestors, African Americans, were not free or American citizens in 1776. And when I looked at the awareness of this came when I took my first Black history class in 1983 at York College, and the professor introduced me to Frederick Douglass's address in 1852. And the title of it, you can go online and find this just by going right on Google. The title of it is What the 4th of July Means to the Negro, 1852. And this is an excerpt. And Douglass gives claim to the joys of what an American republic is. And then he talks about what it means to him as a runaway slave, because even at that point, Frederick Douglass, as popular as he was and as prominent as he was still considered a runaway slave. He says, the fact is, ladies and gentlemen, the distance between this platform and the slave plantation for which I escaped is considerable. This celebration is the 4th of July. It is the birthday of your national independence and of your political freedom. This celebration marks the beginning of another year of your national life. It reminds you that the Republic of America is now 76 years old. The freedom gained is yours, and you, therefore, may properly celebrate this anniversary. The 4th of July is the first great fact in your nation's history, the very ring bolt in the chain of your yet undeveloped destiny. He goes on to say, the Declaration of Independence is the ring bolt in the chain of your nation's destiny. The principles contained in this instrument are saving principles. Stand by those principles. Be true to them on all occasions, in all places, against all foes, and at whatever cost. The signers of the Declaration of Independence were great men. They were great men, too great enough to give frame to a great age. They loved their country better than their own private interests. Your fathers staked their lives, their futures, their fortunes, and their sacred honor on the cause of their country. In their admiration of liberty, they lost sight of all other interests. They were peacemen, but they preferred revolution to peaceful submission to bondage. They were quiet men, but they did not shrink from agitating against oppression. We have to do with the past only as we can make it useful to the present and to the future. And I think that's the prolific phrase that even counts today as we look at what's going on in our country. And I'll repeat that. We have to do with the past only as we can make it useful to the present and to the future. Fellow citizens, pardon me, allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here this day? What have I or those I represent to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and national justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? And am I therefore called upon to bring our humble offerings to the national altar and to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulting from your independence to us? He goes on to say, I say with a sad sense of disparity between us, I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought light and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. The 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. Fellow citizens, above your national tumultuous joy, I hear the mournful wail of millions whose chains, heavy and grievous yet today, are today rendered more intolerable by the jubilee shouts that reach them. My subject then, fellow citizens, is American slavery. I do not hesitate to declare with all my soul that the character and conduct of this nation never looked bleaker to me than on the 4th of July. Whether we turn to the declaration of the past or to the professions of the present, the conduct of the nation seems equally hideous and revolting. America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds itself to be false to the future. How prophetic that statement is. He says, standing with God and the crushed and bleeding slave on this occasion, I will, in the name of humanity, which is outraged, in the name of liberty, which is fettered, in the name of the Constitution and the Bible, which is disregarded and trampled upon, dare to call in question and to denounce with all the emphasis I can command everything that serves to perpetuate slavery, the great sin and shame of America. I will not equivocate, I will not excuse. So when you look at the difference between a July 4th and a Juneteenth, you see two dates that celebrate freedom in American history. One for America and one for Black America. And you see now you have at least three different dates that Black people who were enslaved at that time are finding out that they're free after the end of the Civil War, after the Emancipation Proclamation. And in 1865, you find it in Juneteenth, you find it in August, and then you find it in May in three different states. So this celebration of July 4th is an American celebration. But as I said, our ancestors in 1776 were still enslaved and were not citizens of the United States. So just as the Emancipation Proclamation and the Constitution of the United States are written by rich white men for white America, they are not intended to celebrate the lives of enslaved people in the United States. So I leave you with that history, and I close with two poems that I like to share whenever I'm giving my presentations and open it up for your response and your reactions. Bernard J. Keller once said in this poem, Harvard 8985, if you cannot be the best for yourself, do it for those who were denied an opportunity to be the best. If you cannot fight the fight for yourself, do it for those who fought the wars, but without weapons. If you cannot dream the dream for yourself, dream it for those who could dream, but could never make their dreams come true. If you cannot love you for yourself, love you for those who loved you even as they stepped off the slave ships into a new world, or stood against those who said they were not men or women. If you cannot be proud for yourself, be proud for those who use pride to sustain themselves when they were sentenced to ride in the back of the bus or brave the wild dogs and sentenced to ride in the back of the bus or brave the wild dogs and open fire hoses in order to cast their votes for a candidate of their choice. Do it for yourself if you can, but whenever you cannot do it for yourself, do it for them. Bernard J. Keller also wrote a poem this February called We Are Their Flags and Banners. And I dedicate this to all of the African Americans who are here on this panel, but also all of you who understand what this struggle for freedom and justice and equality still is in this country called the land of the brave and home of the free. He says in his poem, we are their flags and banners, unfurled flapping against the wind. We are the reason they look to the stars as they bore the bite of the whip as it sliced them, or look to the sky when the searing sun scorched their black skins. We are the product of their struggle, of their stubborn refusal to disappear without a trace. We are the words they could not speak and the thoughts they could not read. I love that line. We are the words they could not speak and the thoughts they could not read. We're the dreams they dreamed and the hopes they held. We are the legacy and we are their pride. We are their children. Thank you for allowing me to speak to you again this year. Peace and blessings.